Long before the pyramids of Egypt, millennia before the cuneiform writing of Sumer, thousands of years before any Greek temple, mathematics already existed. And it was born black, born African, born on the shores of Lake Edward, on the border between what we now call Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo. There, in that place forgotten by time, a small, fragile, almost insignificant object was found. A piece of bone about 10 centimeters long, marked with mysterious notches arranged in 3 columns. That bone, the Ishango Bone, is considered by many archaeologists and mathematicians to be the first mathematical artifact of humankind, dated to approximately 20,000 years before Christ. 20,000 years. Let that resonate for a moment. When that bone was carved, Europe was still covered in ice. Mammoths still walked the earth, and agriculture wasn't even a distant dream. And yet, someone was already thinking in numbers, already organizing thought, already searching for patterns in the chaos of existence. The Ishango Bone is not merely an artifact. It is a book, the first book of humanity, written not in words, but in numerical symbols, a language that transcends cultures, a language some call divine. This is the beginning of a journey through time, into the minds of our most distant ancestors, to understand not only how they counted, but why they counted, what they sought, and what legacy they left us. Because that small bone, preserved today in a museum in Belgium, carries something far greater than numbers within its markings. It carries the first spark of human reason, the moment when we ceased merely to exist and began to understand. There is a narrative, a story we were told since childhood, in schools, in books, in documentaries. It's the story that science was born in Greece, with Thales of Miletus, with Pythagoras, with Euclid, or perhaps in Mesopotamia, with the cuneiform tablets of the Sumerians, with the Babylonians and their astronomical tables. This narrative, comfortable, well-documented, endlessly repeated, has one fundamental problem. It is incomplete, because thousands of years before any Greek looked at a triangle and saw theorems, thousands of years before any Sumerian carved numbers into clay, there were already African minds, black minds, deciphering the secrets of the cosmos. The Ishango Bone is the oldest physical proof, but it's not an isolated point. It is the beginning of a line, an unbroken line of African scientific genius stretching across millennia, a line that connects those bone markings to the mathematical and architectural wonders of ancient Egypt. Kemet, the Black Land, because yes, we must say it. Ancient Egypt, Kemet to its own people, was an African civilization. Black. It doesn't matter how many times Hollywood paints the pharaohs white. It doesn't matter how many European museums refuse to acknowledge the obvious. Kemet was Africa, and the Kemites were Africans. And what they achieved with mathematics, geometry, and astronomy was extraordinary. The pyramids of Giza, built over 4,500 years ago, are mathematical marvels. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, with its 2.3 million limestone blocks, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons, is perfectly aligned with the cardinal points, with a precision that challenges even modern engineering. That was no accident. It was calculation, applied trigonometry, sacred geometry, profound knowledge of proportion, of the golden ratio, of the relationship between circumference and diameter we call pi. Egyptian mathematical papyri, such as the Rind and Moscow papyri, reveal complex problems in arithmetic, fractions, area and volume calculations, and equations. They show a well-established, sophisticated mathematical tradition, taught in the houses of life, schools for scribes. But where did this knowledge come from? How did it arise? The answer lies in the Ishango Bone, and in countless other African artifacts, many still buried underground, many destroyed, many stolen and kept in European museums without proper recognition. The transition from symbolic thought to logical thought, the birth of abstract reasoning, did not happen in Greece. It happened in Africa over tens of thousands of years, from those first bone markings to the complex mathematical systems of Kemet. And that transition was not merely intellectual, it was spiritual. For the ancestral African peoples, to know was to connect. To know numbers was to know the rhythms of creation. To know geometry was to know the language of the gods. To know the stars was to know one's own destiny. Science, true science, was born from this union between rigorous observation and spiritual search, between precise measurement and cosmic reverence. but there was a deliberate, systematic effort to erase that truth. European colonialism did not only steal Africa's natural resources, it stole its history, its identity, its knowledge. 19th and early 20th century scientific racism spread the lie that Africans were intellectually inferior, incapable of abstract thought, of science, of civilization. That lie, that epistemic violence, justified horrors. Slavery, colonization, exploitation, and even today, when archaeologists and historians find irrefutable evidence of ancient African genius, there is resistance, minimization, and attempts to attribute these achievements to external influences, claiming the Egyptians were Arabs or Greeks or anything but black Africans. It is absurd, it is dishonest, and it is painfully revealing, but truth is stubborn. The Ishango bone exists, material, dated, undeniable. The pyramids still stand, defying time and false narratives. The mathematical papyri exist, readable, studyable. Great Zimbabwe still rises, with its cyclopean stone walls built without mortar, proving advanced engineering in sub-Saharan Africa. The astronomical observatories of Namora in Kenya, with their stones aligned to constellations, are documented. The advanced African metallurgies that produced high-quality steel when Europe was still in the Bronze Age are recorded. Fractal mathematics, which Western scientists only began to understand in the 20th century, had already been used for centuries in African weaving, architecture, and art. The evidence is everywhere, and the Ishango bone, that small fragment from 20,000 years ago, is the root of it all. It is proof that when science was born, it was born black, born in African hands, under the African sky. And this is not about empty racial pride. It is about historical justice, about recognizing that all humanity, all civilizations, all later scientific advances, drink from an African source. Because all of us, all human beings, came from Africa. And when our most distant ancestors took the first steps toward abstract thought, when they looked up at the sky and began to count the stars, when they carved those first marks into bone, they were not just Africans, they were the dawning humanity. And the first thing humanity did, when it truly began to think, was mathematics. That should tell us something profound about who we are, where we came from, and what we owe to those unknown ancestors who, on the shores of an African lake, beneath a starry sky, counted for the very first time the universe. The year was 1950. Central Africa still lived under colonial rule. The Belgian Congo was a territory exploited, bled dry, but also, paradoxically, a place where European scientific expeditions sought to uncover the secrets of humanity's past. It was in this context, during a geological expedition led by the Belgian scientist Jean de Heinzelin de Brocourt, that the impossible happened. Heinzelin was not an archaeologist. He was a geologist. His interest lay in rocks, in the layers of the earth, in the vestiges of volcanic eras, but destiny, or perhaps ancestry, had other plans. The expedition advanced through the region of Ishango, a remote area near Lake Edward, one of Africa's Great Lakes. Located on the border between Uganda and what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, it was a dramatic landscape. Volcanic mountains rose in the distance. The waters of the lake reflected the infinite sky. And all around, layers upon layers of sediment told the geological history of millions of years. During the excavations, amidst ancient volcanic ash and remains of extinct fauna, something caught Heinzelin's attention. A small object, a fragment of bone about 10 centimeters long, darkened by time, but with something unusual. Marks, deliberate engravings, organized in patterns. They were not random scratches, nor the bite marks of predators. They were intentional. Heinzelin held that bone with reverence. Even without being a prehistory expert, he knew he was in the presence of something extraordinary. The bone was a baboon femur, a common animal in the region, but what had been done with it was far from common. 3 columns of notches ran along the bone, each column containing groups of marks separated by deliberate spaces. There was organization, structure, a code. The notches were not identical. Some groups had 3 marks, others 9, others 10, 11, 21. There was logic there, an intentionality that screamed across the millennia. Someone long ago sat with that bone and carved upon it something important. But what? The context of the discovery made it even more impressive. The Ishango archaeological site turned out to be an ancient human settlement, with remains of hearths, stone tools, and abundant evidence of fishing. Those people, whoever they were, lived by the lake, fished, hunted, and apparently did something more. They thought, they counted, they recorded. Radiocarbon dating later confirmed the unimaginable. The bone was approximately 20,000 years old. Some later studies suggest even 25,000. We are talking about the Upper Paleolithic, the Late Stone Age, when humans were still nomadic hunter-gatherers, when there was no agriculture, no cities, no writing, and yet, there it was, mathematics. Heinzelin's first interpretation was cautious. Perhaps it was a tool handle, or part of an instrument, but the patterns were too specific, too organized. Then another theory emerged, a lunar calendar. The marks could represent the phases of the moon, cycles of 28 days, aligned with female menstrual cycles, or perhaps, more boldly, it was a calculating instrument, a kind of primitive abacus, where each notch represented a unit, and the groupings, mathematical operations, multiplications, duplications, progressions. The scientific community was divided. Some celebrated the discovery as the oldest evidence of mathematical thought. Others, especially those bound to Eurocentric narratives, tried to minimize its importance. They claimed the marks could be decorative, random, meaningless. But those who truly studied the bone, who analyzed the columns, who compared the patterns, knew the truth. There, in that small and fragile fragment, was the voice of a brilliant mind. The voice of someone who, 20,000 years ago, looked at the world and decided to measure it, organize it, understand it through numbers. The Ishango bone was not merely an artifact. It was a testimony, a material proof that the African mathematical mind is ancestral, primordial, foundational. It was physical evidence that long before the cuneiform tablets of Mesopotamia, long before the Egyptian papyri with arithmetic problems, long before any known civilization, there were already humans, African humans, practicing mathematics. And this discovery, made in 1950, should have changed everything. It should have rewritten the history books. It should have placed Africa at the center of the narrative of the origins of scientific thought. But that is not what happened. The Ishango bone was catalogued, studied within closed academic circles, and then forgotten by mainstream history. Stored in a museum in Belgium, far from its homeland, it remained a whispered secret, an uncomfortable truth for those who insisted that science was born in Greece, or Mesopotamia, or anywhere but Africa. But the truth, as always, is stubborn, and that small bone, silent in its glass case, continues to scream through time. I am the proof. I am the beginning. I am the first code. Look closely. Approach the Ishango bone. Let your eyes follow those ancient markings. Each deep incision, each intentional grouping, each deliberate space between clusters. They are not scratches, not random etchings. They are words. Words in a language that existed before languages. The language of numbers. The bone presents 3 distinct columns of notches. Each column runs longitudinally along the baboon's femur, and each seems to tell a different story, or perhaps parts of the same cosmic narrative. The first column, on the left side, contains groupings with the following numbers of notches: 3, 6, 4, 8, 10, 5, 5, and 7. At first glance it may seem random, but look again. 3 and 6, one is the double of the other. 4 and 8, again, duplication. This is not coincidence. It is pattern. It is intentionality. It is mathematics. The second column, in the center of the bone, presents another sequence: 11, 13, 17, and 19. Wait, let that sink in. 11, 13, 17, 19. All prime numbers. Numbers that can only be divided by 1 in themselves. Numbers that the Greeks would not begin to study systematically until 17,000 years later. And there they were, carved into a bone by African hands. At the dawn of humanity. Coincidence? Some skeptics would say so. But when you observe the precision, the sequence, the deliberate selection of these specific numbers, coincidence becomes unlikely. The third column on the right side again shows groupings that suggest operations, duplications and subtractions, a numerical pattern that seems to follow an arithmetic logic, as if someone were practicing, experimenting, playing with relationships between quantities. But there is more, much more. When you add all the notches from the first and third columns, you get 60. 60. The base of the sexagesimal system, the system that millennia later would be used by the Sumerians, and which we still use today to measure time, 60 seconds, 60 minutes, and to measure angles, 360 degrees. Could the Ishango bone be evidence that the base 60 system always attributed to Mesopotamia, in fact has much older African roots. Some researchers have also noted that the total number of marks on the bone, considering all columns, approaches 168, a number that, curiously, is close to half of a full lunar year. This led to the most fascinating theory of all, the theory of the feminine lunar calendar. Think about it. The female menstrual cycle averages 28 days, exactly the duration of a complete lunar cycle, from new moon to new moon. For a people who lived close to nature, who watched the skies every night, who depended on natural cycles to survive, this connection between the female body and the cosmos would not have gone unnoticed. It would have been divine, sacred, essential. And what if the Ishango bone was a record of these cycles? A way for the women of that community to track their own internal rhythms, aligned with the rhythm of the moon. A tool of self-knowledge, of foresight, of power. Because knowledge is power, especially knowledge of the mysteries of fertility, of life, of creation. In many traditional African cultures, mathematical and astronomical knowledge was preserved by elder women, by the wise ones, by the healers. They were the guardians of calendars, the ones who knew when to plant and when to harvest, when the rivers would rise and when they would dry, when the body was fertile and when it was not. The Ishango bone may be the oldest trace of that tradition, an artifact created by female hands. For female hands, an instrument of wisdom passed from generation to generation. But the mathematics on the bone goes beyond simple counting. The patterns suggest an understanding of operations, duplication, the concept of double, subtraction, the notion of difference between quantities, even the primitive idea of prime numbers, special numbers that behave differently. This is not just counting, it is thinking about numbers. It is doing arithmetic. And here we reach a profound truth. In ancient Africa, numbers were not just quantities, they were forces, energies, sacred symbols. In Yoruba traditions, for example, each number has a spiritual meaning, a specific energy, a connection with the Orisa. 3 is movement, 4 is stability, 7 is spiritual perfection. In the Dogon numerology of Mali, numbers structure the universe, tell the story of creation, map the stars, especially Sirius, which they knew in impossible detail without telescopes. This sacred relationship with numbers, this understanding that counting is not merely quantifying but also comprehending, connecting with the cosmos, ordering chaos, finding harmony. All of this was already present 20,000 years ago in that bone engraved on the shores of Lake Edward. The act of counting was an act of cosmic consciousness. When that ancient human sat down to carve those marks, they were not merely recording numbers. They were trying to understand their place in the universe, the dance of the stars, the rhythms of life and death, the patterns that connect all things. They were doing science, and they were doing philosophy, and they were doing spirituality, because for ancestral African peoples, these 3 things were never separate. The Ishango bone is therefore much more than a mathematical artifact. It is a portal into a way of thinking, where number is poetry, where calculation is ritual, where understanding the cosmos is understanding oneself. And when we look at those marks today, with our modern eyes, trained on calculators and computers, on cold and purely functional mathematics, perhaps we have forgotten something essential. Perhaps we have forgotten that before it was a tool, number was sacred. There is a division in the modern world, a deep, almost painful separation between science and spirituality. On one side, reason, logic, the scientific method, cold and objective numbers. On the other, faith, mystery, the sacred, the search for meaning. And we have been taught that these 2 things are opposites, incompatible, that to embrace one, we must reject the other. But that is a modern lie, a consequence of Cartesian separation, of the European Enlightenment rationalism that divided mind and body, reason and emotion, science and soul. In ancestral Africa, this division did not exist. It could not exist, because it would be unnatural. The Ishango bone is not merely a mathematical tool. It is a sacred object, a numerical mandala, a map of spiritual understanding of the cosmos. When that ancient human carved those marks, they were not merely counting, they were praying. They were translating the divine into symbols, finding the language of the gods, participating in the act of creation through comprehension. For traditional African peoples, everything has accès, vital force, energy. Numbers are no exception. Each number is a force, a vibration, a portal to different dimensions of reality. One is the beginning, the source, Oloran, the creator god, the point from which everything emanates. 2 is the primordial division, masculine and feminine, heaven and earth, the duality that allows movement, life. 3 is movement itself, synthesis, the child born from union, dance, rhythm, pulsating life. 4 is stability, the 4 cardinal points, the 4 seasons, the foundation of the material world. Each number, each quantity, is not merely an abstraction. It is a real force operating in the universe. And to understand numbers is to understand these forces, to learn how to work with them, to honor them, to use them to create harmony. This sacred mathematics, this divine geometry, permeates all of traditional African culture. Look at African masks, those forms that Europeans once called primitive. There is nothing primitive there. There is complex geometry, precise proportions, symmetries that express profound spiritual concepts. Every angle, every curve, every proportion was calculated to capture something invisible. An energy, a spirit, a nurisa. African weavings, especially Ghanaian kente cloths and Malian bogolans, follow complex mathematical patterns, fractals, repetitions at different scales, symmetries that are never perfect, because perfection, in the African view, belongs only to the divine. Traditional African architecture, the round houses of the Zulu people, the mud mosques of Timbuktu, the royal palaces of Abomey, all follow geometric principles that are not merely aesthetic. They are symbolic. Each form tells a story. Each proportion reveals a cosmic truth. The circle represents the eternal cycle, birth, death, rebirth. The square, when used, represents the material world, the earth, stability. The spiral, present in countless African artifacts, represents growth, spiritual evolution, the movement of life. And all of this traces back to those first marks on the Ishango bone, to that first moment when a human being realized that the universe speaks in numbers, that there is a mathematical language underlying creation, and that to understand that language is to draw near to the divine. The Dogon of Mali, that extraordinary people, possess astronomical knowledge that baffles modern scientists. They know of Sirius B, the companion star of Sirius, a white dwarf invisible to the naked eye, discovered by Western astronomy only in 1862 with powerful telescopes. And yet the Dogon, for centuries, perhaps millennia, had already spoken of it. They call it Potolo, the smallest seed. They describe its 50-year orbit around Sirius A. They speak of its incredible density, saying it is made of the heaviest matter in the universe. All of it correct. How did they know? The Dogon answer is simple. The Nomo, ancestral beings who came from the stars, taught the Dogon. We may call this myth legend, or we may recognize that somehow, through patient observation over generations, through sophisticated mathematical calculations, through deep understanding of celestial movements, the Dogon, without telescopes, without modern technology, arrived at scientifically correct conclusions, and they did so within a spiritual framework. Their astronomical knowledge is intertwined with their cosmology, their rituals, their art. There is no separation. The Yoruba tradition, one of the great religious and philosophical systems of West Africa, is entirely built upon sacred numbers. The 16 major Odu of the Ifa system, each unfolding into 16 minor Odu, resulting in 256 possible configurations. That is binary mathematics, a system of yes and no, of open and closed, cast through the oracle and containing all the wisdom of the universe. The same binary system that, centuries later, would become the foundation of modern computing. Zeros and ones, presence and absence, coincidence, or evidence that the African mind has always understood that the universe operates through codes, patterns, fundamental mathematical relationships. The Ishango bone, seen in this light, is not just a mathematical artifact. It is a mandala, a meditative symbol, a visual representation of cosmic truths. The 3 columns may represent the 3 dimensions of existence: material, mental, spiritual, the groupings of marks, the cycles of nature, birth, growth, death, the prime numbers in the central column, the irreducible essence, the vital force that cannot be divided, that is indivisible, unique, sacred. To count, for that human 20,000 years ago, was not a mundane activity. It was an act of connection with the cosmos, of participation in the universal rhythm, of recognition that everything is linked, that there is an underlying harmony, an order within apparent chaos, and that to understand this order through numbers was the highest form of wisdom. The Ishango bone teaches us something we have forgotten in modernity, that science without soul, mathematics without meaning, knowledge without reverence, are incomplete, that the search for truth, whether scientific or spiritual, is, at its core, the same search. The search to understand our place in the universe, to find meaning, to connect with something greater than ourselves. And that search began in Africa 20,000 years ago, with a piece of bone and a few carefully carved marks. Marks that said, I see the patterns, I understand the cycles, I participate in the cosmic dance, I count, therefore I exist, and more than that. I count, therefore I am connected to everything that exists. History is not a collection of isolated events, not a random succession of disconnected discoveries. History, true history, is a tapestry, a complex fabric where every thread connects, where every pattern influences the next, where nothing, absolutely nothing, is born from the void. The Ishango bone is not an endpoint. It is not an isolated curiosity of the Paleolithic. It is a seed that germinated, grew, and bore abundant fruit over thousands of years. The mathematics that began there, on the shores of Lake Edward, continued, evolved, flourished in countless forms across the African continent. African numerical systems are diverse, rich, sophisticated. The base 12 system, which some researchers identify in the Ishango bone, appears in various African cultures. 12 lunar months, 12 divisions of day and night. The base 60 system, also possibly present in the bone, reappears not only in Mesopotamia, but also in African traditions of measuring time and angles. The Yoruba of West Africa developed a base 20 numerical system, a vigesimal system that uses subtraction, a mathematically advanced concept. They do not simply say 18, they say 20 minus 2. That requires a higher level of abstraction, an understanding of inverse operations. The people of ancient Kush in Nubia developed their own writing and numbering systems, distinct from the Egyptian but equally sophisticated. The Nubian pyramids, even more numerous than the Egyptian ones, attest to advanced geometric knowledge. The mathematical system of Kemet, ancient Egypt, deserves special attention, because it did not arise from nothing. It is the direct descendant of the tradition that began with the Ishango bone and other artifacts not yet discovered or recognized. The Egyptians used unit fractions, fractions with numerator 1, a system that may seem limited to us today, but reveals deep understanding of division and proportion. They calculated the areas of circles using an approximation of pi that was surprisingly accurate. They developed formulas for the volumes of pyramids and cylinders. They used the 3-4-5 triangle, the perfect right triangle that millennia later would be called the Pythagorean theorem. Though Pythagoras never claimed to have invented it, he likely learned it in Egypt during his 20 years of study there, because yes, the great Greek philosophers, Thales, Pythagoras, Plato, all studied in Egypt in the houses of life under the Kemetic priest mathematicians. They did not invent mathematics, they imported it, translated it, reinterpreted it through their own cultural lens, and in doing so, with the help of later historians, they erased the African origins of that knowledge. But the line continues, beyond Kemet. In later times, Africa continued to produce mathematical brilliance. In medieval West Africa, Timbuktu, Djenné, Gao were centers of learning. The University of Sankore in Timbuktu, founded in the 14th century, held one of the largest libraries in the world. There, African scholars not only preserved Arabic and Greek mathematical and astronomical texts, they expanded them, commented on them, corrected them, created new knowledge. Ahmed Baba, the great scholar of Timbuktu, wrote on dozens of disciplines, including mathematics applied to the division of Islamic inheritances, a complex field requiring sophisticated algebra. The architecture of Mali's mud mosques, especially the Great Mosque of Djenné, demonstrates profound understanding of geometry, proportion, and structural engineering. Those buildings, made entirely of mud, have stood for centuries, defying rain, heat, and time. That is no accident. It is science. African metallurgy, especially among the Yoruba kingdoms and the knock furnaces, produced bronze and iron artworks that astonished Europeans when they finally saw them. The bronze heads of Ife and Benin are technical masterpieces requiring precise knowledge of temperature, metal ratios, complex molds, mathematics applied to metallurgy. And then there is the most fascinating discovery of all: African fractals. In 1988, mathematician Ron Eglash, while studying African architectural and artistic patterns, noticed something extraordinary. Many traditional African structures, villages, palaces, weavings, followed fractal patterns. Fractals are geometric forms that repeat at different scales, where each part contains the shape of the whole. It is complex mathematics that in the West was only studied in the 20th century by Benoit Mandelbrot, but in Africa, entire villages were built using fractal designs. The royal palaces of the Baila people of Zambia, seen from above, reveal perfect fractal structures, circles within circles, each section replicating the pattern of the whole. The weavings, hair braids, masks, pottery patterns, all filled with fractal geometry. This was not conscious in the modern mathematical sense, but it was profound, intuitive knowledge passed through generations, a way of thinking that naturally recognizes the recursive patterns of nature. And where does that way of thinking come from? From that moment, 20,000 years ago, when someone looked at the cycles of the moon, at the repetitions of nature, and began to count, to find patterns, to see the underlying structure. The Ishango bone, therefore, is not a dead relic. It is the origin of a living current of knowledge, a current that has never been broken, even through invasions, slavery, colonization, cultural genocides. The flame lit 20,000 years ago has never gone out. Today, African mathematicians contribute to cutting-edge sciences, number theory, topology, theoretical physics. African physicists work at CERN. African engineers design satellites. African computer scientists develop artificial intelligence algorithms. The line continues. And it is essential, absolutely essential, to reconnect this current, to show the continuity, to destroy the false narrative that Africa was intellectually asleep until awakened by colonization. It is exactly the opposite. Colonization interrupted, destroyed, burned libraries, erased languages, killed sages, dismantled knowledge systems. Africa was not saved by colonialism, it was devastated by it. And yet, knowledge survived, in oral traditions, in rituals, in art, in social structures, waiting to be recognized, valued, studied. The Ishango bone is the symbol of that resistance, of that unbreakable continuity. It sits there in a European museum, far from home, but its message has transcended time. I am the proof that you always knew, always thought, always created. I am the evidence that when humanity began to think mathematically, it did so with an African mind, and everything that came after, every theorem, every equation, every discovery, carries a spark of that first light, ignited on the shores of an African lake, under an infinite sky, by hands that were perhaps feminine, young, curious, and that decided to carve, to preserve, to transmit, knowledge as sacred heritage, mathematics as ancestral link, number as a bridge between the human and the divine. This is the legacy of Ishango, and it belongs to all of us. The museum is silent. Somewhere in Belgium, behind a glass display, rests a small fragment of bone, dark, ancient, almost insignificant to distracted eyes. People pass by, glance briefly, read the plaque that says 20,000 years, mathematical markings, and move on. But if you stop, if you truly look, if you let time fall silent around you and simply contemplate, you will hear a voice, the voice of someone who lived 20 centuries ago, someone whose name we will never know, whose face we will never see, but who left us something precious, a message carved in a universal language, the language of numbers. And that message says, I existed, I thought I understood. And more than that, I counted, because counting was sacred. The Ishango Bone is many things. It is the first mathematical artifact of humanity, the oldest material proof of abstract thought, the evidence that science was born in Africa. It is a lunar calendar, perhaps created by women to map their own cycles in harmony with the cosmos. It is a calculating instrument, demonstrating knowledge of duplications, prime numbers, arithmetic operations. It is a sacred object, a numerical mandala that unites science and spirituality into a single symbol. But above all, the Ishango Bone is the first code, the first moment when the human mind tried to capture the universe in symbols, to transform experience into abstraction, to translate chaos into order. It was the simultaneous birth of reason and spirituality, because for those ancestors, these two things were inseparable. To understand numbers was to understand the gods. To calculate cycles was to participate in creation. To count was to pray, and that is something we have lost in modernity. We divided the world into compartments, science here, religion there, reason on one side, emotion on the other, and by doing so, we lost the holistic vision, the understanding that everything is connected, that the universe is one, a harmonious dance of forces where mathematics, art, and spirituality are merely different faces of the same truth. The Ishango Bone invites us to remember, invites us to recover that ancient way of seeing the world, where to know was not to dominate, but to connect, where science was not exploration, but reverence. Today, we live in a world dominated by technology, by numbers, by algorithms. We calculate everything, we quantify everything. We have computers that process trillions of operations per second, artificial intelligence that solves equations no human could solve alone. And yet, we have forgotten something essential. We have forgotten that the first number was born from human hands looking up at the sky. We have forgotten that mathematics began as poetry, as an attempt to converse with the cosmos, as a way to find our place in the vastness of the universe. The Ishango Bone reminds us of this. It tells us that before we were technological beings, before we mastered machines, we were beings who counted stars with reverence, who marked lunar cycles with devotion, who saw in numbers not tools but sacred symbols. And perhaps, just perhaps, we need to recover a little of that. We need to remember that every equation hides a story, that every number carries meaning, that mathematics is not just utility, it is beauty, mystery, connection with something greater. The story of the Ishango Bone also teaches us about justice, about the importance of recognizing origins, of honoring sources, of telling the full truth about where we come from. For too long, the narrative has been that Africa was a continent without history, without science, without contribution to human progress. That lie justified horrors, and that lie still persists in subtle forms. But the Ishango Bone, along with countless other evidences, destroys that narrative. It proves that when humanity began to think, when it took its first steps on the path of knowledge, it did so in Africa, and everything that came after, every civilization, every discovery, every invention, drinks from that primordial source. To acknowledge this is not to diminish other cultures, it is simply to honor the truth. And the truth is, Ishango is not the past. Ishango is the origin, the 0 point, the founding moment when humankind discovered that the cosmos could be counted, understood, spoken to through symbols. And from that moment, 20,000 years ago, to this very instant in which you hear or read these words, there runs an unbroken line. A current of knowledge that crosses cultures, continents, millennia. You now, making any calculation, using any number, are connected to that ancestral human. You are continuing that first act of counting. You are honoring, perhaps without knowing, that sacred heritage. So the next time you look at numbers, at equations, at mathematical patterns, remember the Ishango Bone. Remember that it all began with someone on the shores of an African lake, carving marks into bone, trying to understand, trying to connect, trying to count the universe. And know that when you count, when you calculate, when you seek patterns, you are not merely using a tool. You are participating in an ancestral tradition. You are speaking a language that has existed since the dawn of human consciousness. You are continuing the legacy of Ishango.